welcome to tonight's ThinkIn. My name is Lara Spirit and I am a reporter here at Tortoise. And tonight we are discussing, as our kind of essay question of the evening, William or Harry. And we are joined by a fantastic guest in the newsroom, the royal reporter for the Daily Express, Richard Palmer. And online as well, we're lucky to be joined by Dr. Laura Clancy, who is lecturer of media at Lancaster University. We're also lucky to be joined by a number of people here in the room tonight, as well as people at home. This question might seem slightly facetious and playful, but it is, of course, actually quite a serious question because it goes to the root of the monarchy as it exists today and the monarchy as we think it might well or not exist in the future. So I'm quite keen actually just to do some scene setting, if possible, Richard, with kind of what actually is the feud as it's commonly understood, because I think people have been so bombarded by stories over the past few years that it's quite difficult to understand what we actually mean when we say William versus Harry. And of course, this question, the premise of it is that there is this kind of feud or split. But if you could maybe just say a bit about actually when we talk about William versus Harry, what do you think that question really means?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard as a royal correspondent to get to the truth sometimes of what's going on inside a family, inside any family, really. It's difficult, but members of the royal family, they do speak to journalists, but they don't tend to speak about really personal things going on. So it's all distilled through third parties, but the best I can take a stab at it really is to say that the relationship between the brothers, I think possibly we in the media played it up a little bit, that they were really close, and there were always tensions, as there are in lots of families. But when Harry started dating Meghan, I think it really got quite strained. And as far as I understand it, the origins of that were really that William, really trying to be a protective older brother, was just suggesting that Harry might be rushing a little bit headlong into getting engaged, and should he take a little bit more time to think about it? And don't think Harry took too kindly to that at all. And it just got worse and worse. I mean, I can remember being at Windsor a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when they were there for, it was on the Queen's birthday, but it was also Easter Sunday. And you could just tell by the body language. Mike Tyndall was separating them. They needed somebody to physically separate them, just because you could just tell by the body language that they just weren't speaking to each other. So there were also problems, I think, in their working relationship, because from quite an early stage, I think Harry and Meghan as a unit saw their future as something that they'd really wanted to go down a commercial path. They wanted to raise money for the causes that they thought were important, but also to do things that William and Kate felt they couldn't do as senior members of the family. So obviously it all came to a head when the Sussexes decided that they just couldn't go on, and I have to say a big part of that was to do with us in the media. They really didn't take to the public scrutiny that they got and the criticism they received. And as far as I can tell, the brothers still aren't really getting on very well at all. And who can say when? My paper's editorial line is that we want to see them get back together. Really? We want to see reconciliation between them. I think the Queen's quite keen on it, but not much sign of it happening yet.
And I was going to ask you about this because I'm very interested in kind of the life of reporting on the family. You talk about the body language, and when I was reading quite a lot of it today, there was so much on the body language that made me think, like, how much of this do you actually see in terms of the feud between them? How much of it do reporters actually necessarily witness? Because the kind of royal reporting as a kind of craft sits quite aside from some other ways in which people do journalism, for example, and it has a very particular kind of culture and.
I think we've definitely seen it with Harry. He used to be this happy-go-lucky character who did wear his heart on his sleeve and would engage in banter and let reporters know, including reporters from much posher papers than mine if he felt that they'd written things that weren't quite accurate. But he always did it in a fun way, and I think most journalists enjoyed engaging with him. But over the last 18 months of his time as a working royal, you just go to engage with him, you just sit there scowling at everybody and making it very plain that he didn't want you there, really.
But there were some who he did confide in and get on with. Was that?
So, well, there were a couple working for overseas media. I think the other thing to say about the Megxit, as it became known, is that it became apparent within the household, that Harry and Meghan upset so many people and proved to be so difficult to work with and for, that it just became widely known that there were problems there. And so these stories got out. I mean, I don't think they were necessarily deliberately leaked, but it was just gossip, I suppose. Just people people got fed up with every time they did an engagement. There was an inquest afterwards. Why did we allow them? Why did we allow them to report that? Why did they say that? Why did we say that? Why did we do that? And it was, just an unpleasant experience, I think, for many people to work for them.
Has it been in your career in terms of reporting the royal family? Has this particular feud and upset been worse than anything else that you've reported? Do you think it's changed the way that royal reporting works?
Well, I mean, it has been a huge story, but of course then so has Prince Andrew been such a huge story that, I mean, we've been accused in the media, British media, of ignoring Andrew, but I mean, thousands of stories have been written about him in the last, since 2011, 2012, and certainly since 2015. I think the Harry and Meghan story has been probably the most dramatic.
And is there a divide between international media and British media on this question? Because we saw some of the polling before here, but there's a divide in terms of the answer to this question, whether or not people favour Harry or William, in terms of whether or not you're from Britain or the US, for example. So do you think that's reflected in the way that people report on this, in your experience? I
mean, I do believe that the US media has pursued a narrative which I think I don't believe is right, that their American princess was wronged by the Brits and by the British media in particular, and that it's all down to racism. And I don't really believe that's the case. I mean, I think the British media did really embrace Meghan when she arrived on the scene. She was seen as a breath of fresh air, and great addition to the national soap opera, which the royal family is really, a new character, glamorous character, and from my point of view, and I think from every reporter's point of view, it's such a shame that it's ended up like this. But the American media has sided with them, as I see it, and given more credence to their side of the story than I think. I mean, obviously, it takes two to tango. There's always two sides to a story, but I think they've been more sympathetic to the Sussexes than they perhaps should have been.
Some of the pro-Harry media, so to speak, have criticised some of the British royal reporters on the grounds that William plays the game with them, and he kind of, he'll give the picture of his children that they want. He understands the contract and the unwritten contract that there is between the journalists who report on the royal family and the royals themselves. How much do you think of that is fair?
I mean, I think it's certainly true that both brothers obviously were I mean, that what happened to their mother, etc., affected them deeply. And I think both of them at times have really resented what they have to do for the public, but also for the media. But I think the Cambridges have just accepted that this is what this is what being a member of the royal family involves. And I think generally where the Sussexes have suffered negative media coverage, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it has been because that's what the readers, that's what the public have been saying. And so, for example, you look back to Archie's christening, and the fact is, if you wanted to find out who were my godparents, if you knew when I was christened, you could go to the parish records of the church and find out. And you can find out for anybody in this country, apart from members of the royal family, because they have a special record of royal christenings. And the quid pro quo of that not being made public has always been that members of the royal family told the media who the godparents were, but the Sussexes didn't. And I think it sounds like a little thing really, but that sort of thing created resentment amongst the public.
Yeah, it does, because to me it sounds sort of, it's like, well, whose business? Harry could well say it's not your business, right? So you can kind of see why. But I'm interested. I'm getting some pressure in the chat to do a poll, and I realised at the beginning we didn't do any sort of poll. But Phoebe's running the chat. Hi, Phoebe.
Hi, Laura.
Do you want to talk a bit about what people are saying in the chat about this, and if it's possible to do a poll with people at home? Otherwise, we'll just do one in the newsroom.
I think I don't know if we can do one at home, but I feel like it's quite easy to do a William or Harry in the chat. That I think we can kind of manage it that way. And also I think it's important to, like, that's a very simple question. Obviously, there's a lot more going on. And I think there's been a couple of good comments on, I think Tessa had a direct question on the frustrations around freedom of reporting on things like William, in terms of international press kind of getting away with a little bit more on the way that they can report on it, and a little bit less scrutiny from the kind of the American magazines. And also a good question of it's all just kind of distracting from other issues at the moment. For example, everything that's happening in government is an easy way to kind of deflect from that. But I mean, that's a very big question about royal reporting in general. So
Okay, interesting. Well, if people can put in the chat just very simply William or Harry, and then in the room, just very quickly as a show of hands instinctively, who would say William? Okay, and who would say Harry? I would say that's basically, for those who can't see at home, a sort of 50-50 split. Giles?
No way. Okay, no, but in the room it was all Harry, wasn't it?
No, it was the sort of, Giles, it was a 50-50 split.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see.
You're so...
They didn't raise high enough, that's why they were kind of embarrassed, Giles.
Whereas Liv shot her hand straight up. Giles, do you want to explain why?
Yeah, I'll put aside. I will acknowledge first of all that I'm a Republican.
Our resident Republican.
I'm not the only one. I don't believe in the institution, but we can compartmentalise that and talk about these two. And I think that the sooner, the issues are linked. I'm sorry. The sooner that we get from the status quo to a more normal, shrunken North European royal family, if we have to have one, the better. So the question for me becomes, which of the two of them seems more naturally equipped to make the transition? And I think it's Harry. And I particularly admire his choice of life partner, who has survived and thrived in the world's toughest meritocracy. She might be a bit of a diva, but by the standards of all the other divas in LA, not even close. And I reported from there for 6 years, so I saw a few of them. And I have tremendous admiration for her as a talent, as a go-getter, exactly what the royal family needed to blast through it like a guided missile. And I think it's absolutely no surprise that she was completely infuriated by the institution the moment she encountered it. So that's a digression on her. So I'm just inclined to side with Harry as the person who managed to persuade her to go out with him, and also who has shown a lot of initiative in the real world and courage in Afghanistan, and I'm referring in the initiative to Invictus, and the slide showed that the deals with Netflix and Spotify have pulled in money. I mean, it remains to be seen if any of the productions that they between them back yield any genuine revenue. But there's a keenness to get on with life and try to forge the best kind of, I mean, a commercial existence. I accept that the way the rules are written, that is very difficult for William, but still it's ultimately his call as to whether to accept them.
And Matt, can I come to you? Because you chose William.
Well, yes. It's quite hard to follow that kind of stud muffin pitch for Harry. But because I'm certainly not going to make that particular claim on behalf of William. And also it's a forced choice, don't forget. I mean, I'm not a...
Very like you to challenge the premise of the question, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So I choose William on the basis that I assume that right or wrong Giles isn't going to get his way and there isn't going to be a republic. There is going to be a succession within the monarchy. And that leads me to a second conclusion, which is that there is also not going to be a kind of Harry and Meghan style overhaul of the monarchy because the overhaul that they implicitly envisage is non-monarchical. I mean, it totally takes the monarchy from the evolutionary progression that it's undergone, including in the aftermath of the death of their mother, to something completely different. Now, that's not monarchy. It may be something that's good. It may be a way of having a head of state that's attractive and that is consistent with the world of social media and celebrity and so on. But it isn't monarchy. William is very dull by comparison with Harry, but also he has set himself completely in line with what I would consider a medium point between the past and the sort of future outlined by his mother and pursued much more vigorously by Harry. And that's an unsexy position to defend, but it seems to be working to the extent that actually what, as the slide showed, what a lot of people seem to want is that when the Queen finally dies, as his mother hoped, the succession jumps a generation to William rather than his father, Charles. Now, again, this is very much of the age. It's wanting to be half monarchical. You know, that's not how it works. You don't jump a generation in monarchy. That's the problem. It is a dynasty. That's the problem. It is an institution. That's the problem. But given that still seems to be what people want, William makes more sense in that context. And I think he gets a slightly raw deal in some of the commentary because, you know, he has been a very vigorous defender of mental health, as his mother wanted him to be, and many other causes. He's less flashy, he's less passionate than Harry. He doesn't have a deal with Netflix, he doesn't have a deal with Spotify. He's never going to have a deal with Netflix or Spotify because the heir to the throne can't really have that sort of deal. But given the premise, which is we live in a monarchical country where the Queen in Parliament is sovereign, William is the better bet.
Interesting. Okay, I mean, in light of that, I'm quite keen now to bring in Laura, who I think is at home. I don't know if we can get her up, just because I'm interested in this question about whether or not, in a sense, when we talk about this question, there's a narcissism of small differences. And Laura, in your book, you talk about the relationship that both of these characters have with money specifically. And I'm struck listening to Giles and Matt talking about the different models because both of them involve two very wealthy individuals and two kind of near identical forms of capitalism, or at least compliance with like the capitalist model. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about whether or not in that sense you think it's a false choice.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's kind of, and I agree with lots of the debate that I think in lots of ways William represents the status quo. And Harry represents something very different. And I kind of think that's always been the case. I don't think that's something new since Meghan. I think in lots of ways that's always happened. So when we saw him in the tabloid media in Las Vegas and all of these things, he's kind of always been, the one that takes the risk. I think, there's been a lot of discussion since Harry and Meghan left about them commercializing the monarchy and kind of doing, all these deals and taking all this money off the back of, branding Sussex Royal and all of this. But I wonder if actually, are the rest of the royals doing something very similar actually? Like, what's actually the difference between that and something like Duchy Originals, for example, that Prince Charles runs? There's this aspect of commercialism that is embedded in monarchy anyway, and I guess it's just perhaps more visible with Harry and Meghan because they're not kind of inside that royal fold anymore. They've kind of gone beyond that. And though in lots of ways, the Kensington Royal Instagram account is doing very similar things in terms of trying to make the Cambridges quite relatable and like an ordinary family and all of these things, just as Harry and Meghan have kind of tried to do. And of course, they're still, Harry and Meghan might have kind of stepped away from that, but they're still elites, right? They're still incredibly wealthy. They're still, incredibly privileged and all of these things. So I would question whether, what we're seeing is actually that different anyway.
And if you were looking at the people who support both of them, you've been talking kind of about the Instagram accounts and maybe the people that run them. Is there an obvious difference in the kind of PR operations of the two brothers?
I think Kate and William very much represent still that kind of very traditional version of monarchy. So in my book, I kind of talk about the model that Queen Victoria kind of ran in terms of having it looking like it's part of a nuclear family. There was pictures of them looking after their children and looking after their young children. In lots of ways, I think Kate and William do something quite similar in terms of these kind of very staged, very choreographed photo shoots of them like taking the children to school and things like that. So it gives, it suggests access, right? And it suggests intimacy with them in order to kind of give the general public a feeling as though they're kind of connecting with them. But then, of course, we're not, right? We're seeing a very staged version. We're seeing photographs they've chosen to release. I think Harry and Meghan stand against that is quite interesting, actually, because, they talk a lot about privacy. And of course, it is very different for them. And it's very different for them now they're in America. And it's on very different terms for them, considering, a lot of the discourse around Meghan has been incredibly sexist and incredibly racist. So I think it's waged on very different terms. But I also think, the monarchy is a public institution. And, we very rarely get to hold them to account because of kind of the privileges the institution has. So the only kind of semblance of that we have is having access to these, to these moments. A baby being born into the monarchy isn't a private moment because it's a public institution, and that baby might one day be the king or the queen or whatever. So it's not as simple, I think, as saying something's private and something's public. There's something much more complicated going on.
And can you, in your book, you talk a lot about the way that the royal family use money, and I'm interested in this particular relationship and that particular question, because we were talking just before about royal scrutiny, and we've been quite interested in the newsroom I'm particularly interested in the difference in scrutiny that we've applied as society to, say, the renovation of Parliament, in which kind of every single moment of that building process has kind of had huge amounts of scrutiny. And then the renovations to Buckingham Palace, largely unused, 300+ million, I think it is, which have just seemingly had a semi-blank check. And because of the way that the two parties relate to the royal family, there's been relatively little scrutiny about it at all, really.
Well, I think there's relatively little scrutiny of monarchy, full stop. That would be my argument. I think, when was the last time you saw on like BBC commentary or a Republican come on and kind of call out and say, well, actually, why are we even having this conversation? Why aren't we talking about why does the monarchy even exist? I still think that's quite rare. So I think money is part of that, and the way the money is reported is part of that. And I think there's a general misunderstanding around how royals are financed. And it's really complicated, actually, how royals are financed. So it's no wonder there's kind of misunderstanding about that. And I think often these things just kind of maybe aren't set out and aren't kind of explained. And I think there's also the factor of the royals are kind of taken for granted. And I think the monarchy is kind of taken for granted. It's part of the kind of the fabric of Britain. It's kind of not understood in the same way as Parliament or whatever, as an institution that needs that kind of focus. So I think there's an aspect of that in that, people don't don't query it because they don't feel the need to, or they don't feel it's relevant, or they feel I've been told about my book, well, there's much more important things to be writing about in the world. And I kind of say, well, actually, monarchy is connected to all of those things. Monarchy is connected to inequality. Monarchy is connected to issues of poverty. All of those things are connected. And I think maybe that's also not talked about as fully as it probably could be.
Okay, well, a lesson to get Giles on the BBC more then, I think. I'm keen, before Phoebe, we go to some people in the chat. That'd be great if you could pick out. I'm keen. We chatted before, Richard, about the kind of demographic breakdown of how we perceive the rules. And I think in light of what Giles and Matt were saying about the future of the monarchy, it's quite interesting what you were saying before about the characteristics which will make you more likely to support William versus those which will make you more likely to support Harry, for example.
Yeah,
so people in my generation, much more pro-Harry, for example. I think
the polling shows that the younger, darker skinned you are, more left of centre you are, the more likely you are to be sympathetic to Harry and Meghan, and the whiter and more right of centre, older you are, the more likely you are to be more sympathetic to the whole institution of monarchy, and really not be very keen on the Sussexes. And I think in the States there's an even starker divide. I mean, these are real generalisations, but in general, Republicans seem to be anti-Sussex and Democrats seem to be pro-Sussex.
And they've done a lot of polling, have they?
There's been a bit of polling.
Interesting.
And while we're on polling, I mean, there was a really interesting opinion poll yesterday. It was commissioned by Republic, but it was done by YouGov, so I've had a lot of stick for reporting it online from royalists because they're saying, well, it was commissioned by Republic, but it was done by a professional polling company. And that really shows that in the run-up to this Platinum Jubilee long weekend of celebrations, support for the monarchy is dropping, and support for abolishing the monarchy is getting bigger each time. So YouGov have done similar polls over the last few years, and the proportion of people supporting the monarchy, whereas 10 years ago, the Diamond Jubilee, it was sort of 70 to 75% in general, with about 15 to 20% expressing support for a republic. That figure has gradually gone up to about 27% now, saying they would support replacing the monarchy with an elected president, and only about 60% saying they support the monarchy. And when you look at the age groups, 40% of under 25s would like to abolish the monarchy. It may well have always been the case, I'm sure it has been, that younger people have always been less keen on the monarchy, but as they grow older, they accept it more. But I think also that over the last 10 years, the younger royals did win a lot of fans from younger people, and I think this split between Harry and William has alienated a lot of younger people from the institution.
And is it possible in that poll to look at the difference that's happened since Harry and Meghan and since the split specifically?
There has been some polling on that, but
But you suspect it's had a difference?
Yes, I do. And on that, I should say that there are two things to say really. I think on one hand, the royal family on its official website has a mission statement that says the royal family exists to act as a force for national unity, continuity, and stability. So when it becomes divisive, when people are really divided about individuals in the monarchy, then that should be a cause for concern, I'd say. But then on the other hand, I think if we stop caring about the royal family, then that's when they should get really worried, because when it's no longer relevant to people.
And do you think that people within the royal family would see this feud? How would they compare it with what's happened with Prince Andrew, for example? Because often in reporting, it's presented this feud as if it is just as damaging in some way to the could be to the future of the royal family. But do you really think that is true?
I'm guessing to a certain extent, but I think from what I have been told that they're obviously concerned about it. They're concerned that it's damaged their reputation. You know, that the Sussexes have levelled accusations of racism at the family and the institution. On the other hand, allegations of bullying have been levelled at Meghan. It's not a good look at all, is it, for the whole institution? So I do think they need to sort it, really.
What is the process of reconciliation, possible process of reconciliation for Harry and William? Is there any chance? Is there any high chance of it, do you think?
Well,
Especially
there must be at some at some point, you would think. But I can't really see Harry and Meghan coming back into the fold to be working members of the family again. I think I suppose I look back in history towards Edward and Mrs. Simpson as an example, and I think I'm not sure they were always that happy in their marriage, but they managed to stay married and out of the firm for the rest of their lives. But of course, they always needed to be associated with their former lives to make a living, and there were endless memoirs and other projects to try and capitalise on that.
And it's interesting what you said just a moment ago about the real danger of the royal family being a level of apathy. So that's the difficult. To me, I find that relationship quite difficult because when you read the press about this, it seems as if it's very publicly damaging and would engender, to a certain extent, a large amount of antipathy, especially among young people, for example, who are, of course, like, the future and the legitimacy of the royal family will, in a certain extent and in a number of years, depend on them. But what you're saying is that you think it's actually more damaging to the future of the monarchy if people start to actually not care. And so to a certain extent, this media ecosystem of reporting on it, you think might be contributing counterintuitively to the health of the monarchy, which seems like slightly strange.
Yeah, I mean, it is a national soap opera, and I think if you look back down the years, virtually every member of the family has gone through a stage where they've been regarded as the bête noire, and Princess Anne certainly had a spell when she was very unpopular. I can remember when I was first starting to do this job back in sort of the early 2000s, there were pictures of Edward handing one of his children as a baby to an aide, and people were having a go at him about that. And I think if you look back, I mean, interesting the debate about who's boring, who's dull, who's exciting. I suspect very similar conversation was had back in the 1940s and 50s about Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret was the exciting, risky one. Would she have made a better monarch? I don't think so.
Interesting. And Phoebe, do you want to just run through what some people are saying in the chat? Because
so I think on the reconciliation, Debbie said she can't come on camera, but she said, is there an argument to have both William and Harry for a 21st century royalty, a heritage arm and a commercial arm, and then they could work together as a team, which I think is quite interesting. Thinking of them as a business plan and an idea for more of a company, and like how that could work and how could they work together rather than kind of conflicting on their commercial interests and their private interests. But if it's possible, I think, so one of the things that stood out to me was Trisha Mitchell and Zoe Blakemore messaged almost at the same time. So Trisha said that infuriated by Meghan, not necessarily a gold digger, but only there for the money and kudos. And then we had Zoe say, the Meghan bashing feels like old controlling wife trope, drives me nuts, Harry not being manipulated. And that was exactly the same time. So if we could have you guys up. I just saw Trisha. So if we could hear from Trisha, because I'd actually be interesting to know, is it, do you think it's because she was a celebrity beforehand, and that's why you feel that way? Or I feel like I'm looking down at my camera, but that's because I can see you in two different places. But I'd be interested to know what you think, Trisha.
Well, I've got quite a lot of views on this. One, I don't think that we drove her out because of racism. We gave her a £20 million wedding, and she buggered off within 2 years. And I feel in relation to the presenter or the co-host of the meeting that Harry is a bit like Edward VIII in that he abdicated and then spent the rest of his life in miserable cohabitation with his wife, and I'm not entirely sure about her motives. I would like to find out why did she stay here for 2 years and then disappear. I'm speechless by it, because, and today I have to say, on the bus, I overheard an older woman of my age saying to a younger woman on the bus, "And what did the Jubilee celebrations mean to you?" And the younger woman shrugged and said, "Nothing, just completely irrelevant," which is not upsetting, but and not surprising, but I think it's how the younger people view the royal family.
Does it make you angry when you hear of young people saying things like that, and in some sense being apathetic about the royal family? Does that make you angry?
It doesn't make me angry, but I actually wasn't surprised, because I think we've moved beyond the royal family being the be all and the be all of our lives and the country. It's moved on from that, and I just think perhaps they are becoming irrelevant, and I'm not quite sure about the tussle between William and Harry. I don't think Harry should take over. He hasn't got any right to take over unless he physically stabs his brother in the back and takes over that way. I can't quite see Harry ever being in the picture again.
Yeah, I think that's really. If we could hear from Zoe as well, because I'd be interested to know if you had similar thoughts. If not, then I think there's a couple of other people in the chat we can see.
Zoe.
Hi, Zoe.
Hi
Thank
there.
you for joining. So I was just interested to know, do you think that how much kind of the media, I'm guessing by Meghan bashing you mean kind of the stuff that was in the media and the way that was presented. So if you want to like all come back to anything on the kind of Trisha was saying, it'd be good to have a kind of good conversation about that, I think.
I think there have been a lot of, not necessarily explicit, but implicit biases at play. I think there has been an element of misogyny about the way that certain stories have been angled. If you compare the coverage of Meghan and Kate, I think it was quite obvious that there were differences. I think it's quite difficult to say, I'm not saying that the British public were necessarily racist in their approach, and obviously we don't know what's gone on within the royal family, but I think there are some fairly easy and tired tropes that some of the news headlines decided to go with. Was it Straight Outta Compton? That was, it was just dreadful. And then some of the comparisons about the way that Kate and Meghan approached their pregnancy when they've done almost exactly the same thing, but one was portrayed positively and one was portrayed negatively. So I think there was a little bit of bashing, just the line of least resistance to generate a bit of clickbait. And then there's also quite a lot of bashing, and I've never really understood it, actually, amongst my friendship group. I seem to be the only one who doesn't think that Harry is being deeply manipulated by a gold-digging, kudos seeking wife, and everyone seems to think she must have known what she was getting herself into. I don't think that she did, and I think we make an assumption that American culture and perception of the royals and understanding of royalty is the same as ours. I think she just thought she was moving to another celebrity life, and she wasn't, and she didn't get it. And I don't think you do get it unless you're here and you really feel how monarchy is woven into the fabric of UK life and the perceptions of people like the Queen and how the firm works. That's not a normal celebrity setup. It's bizarre, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think like it's easy to assume the British public is racist, and I think the point about the wedding is actually quite interesting, because it feels like we've come a long way since the weddings, and they're obviously such key markers in the royal calendar. I also thought it'd be good to come to Kirsty, because she made a really good point. I think we've talked about it a few times, is the mental health work that the royals do, which is somewhere that they all campaign. But so Kirsty, the point that you kind of raised was that, but they've been accused of aggravating mental health issues in each other, and then there's kind of a long history there, of course, with Diana. So I was interested to know, like, where do you think they lie? Is it an easy win as a campaigning thing? Is that what you're trying to say?
I don't know that it's necessarily an easy win for them. I think it's something that both groups are passionate about, but it gets like each camp, if we'll call it that, throws it around like that's the gold star, that's the be all and end all. Like neither one can be accused of anything because they campaign for mental health, and that is so important. But also, both sides have accused the other. There's the idea that Meghan made Kate cry at her wedding, and vice versa. Meghan says that they kind of held her prisoner and that she was on the verge of doing something to herself. Both sides refute the others. So yeah, I just think that when everyone says, "Oh, they do so much for mental health," I'm like, but they also say that the other other one has aggravated their mental health, and all of this surely does aggravate their mental health. The idea that that you're in a feud with your family and everybody knows about it has got to make that worse. I don't know why it's any of our business whether people get on. I love gossip as much as the next person, but I don't need to put it in a newspaper.
I mean, Richard, you were just nodding there, and we were talking earlier about how there's a kind of grim tragedy to the fact that for both of these men, mental health is such an important part of what they've been campaigning for in a way, and that this feud itself will be exacerbating probably the struggles that they're both feeling.
Yeah, and they're very sensitive about it as well. I mean, I think it was the Times ran a story levelling accusations at William of being a bully, and he really, reacted quite vehemently.
And do you see that reaction? How do you know that it's a vehement reaction from William?
You see the reaction from the press statement, or
and you can judge their tone compared to other. Okay.
Yeah, but it does damage. It damages everything they do. I mean, I was talking on the Express's Facebook Live show yesterday about how Princess Eugenie had launched this series of podcasts about modern slavery and trafficking without actually mentioning that her father had just paid out millions to somebody who said she was a victim of sex trafficking. He's not admitted any liability, I should say, but equally, how do William and Kate, how do Harry and Meghan do engagements that are about family relationships or about bullying or about racism when all of this is still hanging over them? It does damage the brand and damage their reputations, I think.
And I think Liv, we were talking about this earlier, your journey through Prince Harry, for example, and the ways in which our relationships to these two guys do change over time.
Totally. So when he wore the swastika to the party,
How old was he then?
Was he 16, 17? He was young.
Yes.
He'd been given really bad information, or he hadn't asked anybody, or I'm just like, literally, what the F? And I was so angry and so cross and was like, I've already made up my mind. I'm absolutely never going to like him. And then all of the rumours in 2019 about Prince William started to emerge. And I was a bit like, is that one of the reasons that they fell out? Like, can Harry condone his brother allegedly having an affair, if it's real or not?
Are you allowed to talk about that, really?
Can we talk about it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, all I can say about that is I've never found any evidence to support those allegations, and certainly both families denied that anything had happened.
James, you're holding the mic. What do you think?
Wow.
Cool, then.
Thank you. I'm glad you're asking me. I'm not sure whether we're allowed to say anything on that, are we?
No, not.
Gentleman's rules.
Okay.
It's not. It's filmed, John.
You can mercifully hand over to Patricia, James.
Come on. This is.
Okay. Someone give Giles a mic so the people at home can hear. Giles is shouting.
Sorry.
Giles has got 2 mics.
Giles, can you shout into the mic?
I do apologise.
What were you saying about why we shouldn't feel?
I don't think we should be
Reservations about
afraid
speaking
of saying any. We shouldn't be any more afraid of saying anything about any royals than we are about saying anything about anybody. That's all. On the subject of the alleged affair in 2019, which William is alleged to have had with a anyway.
Patricia, I think, had
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
I was just going to say, so I grew up in Spain, so obviously my perception of the monarchy is slightly different based on the news that I saw there. and so much of it for us is centered around the Queen. And I think that's the case for a lot of people internationally. The Queen and Princess Diana.
So you didn't see much of Harry and William growing up?
Only within the context of what happened to Princess Diana and them being her children. So then I guess I'm interested in, before William and Harry, there's Charles. And I wonder whether there's that same, internationally, I wonder whether people will that will completely change how they see the monarchy.
What was the perception of Charles growing up? Just now?
Oh, people hated him. He was horrible because of
Diana.
Did to Diana, and then he sort of became irrelevant. And I wonder, when he eventually takes over, I think that will have, a lot of people will still see him in that light.
And how is this question of Harry and William perceived in the Spanish media, for example?
I have no idea. I've no. Well,
but the feud isn't sort of
it really. Yeah, it's complicated. From what I've heard of him, actually, I've had a lot of the same Meghan Markle's a traitor narrative. But we're also a monarchy, and there's been a lot of that. But that's possibly a generational split as well.
Okay, and is there a partisan coverage of like the British monarchy, for example, in Spain? Would you say not at all?
Yeah. I guess my question is more that how much do you what do you think Charles's reign will change the question of William and Harry? Do you think that there will be a shift because of, like, how much role does the Queen play now?
Well, I think the first thing to say about Charles's reign is I think he is. I was dubious about it when I first started doing this job, but it is clear that he does want to see a smaller group of working members of the royal family, in the same way that's happened in Spain and some of the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, etc. You can see the pattern all over Europe. The royal families are getting smaller in terms of the working members, and I think Charles sees the role of the monarchy in a slightly different way. Broadly, it's less about turning up, cutting ribbons and saying, "Have you come far?" And it's more about making a big difference to people, making a difference. I always describe it as a more muscular monarchy, and I think the younger royals have reflected that in the work they were doing before the big split, and I think William and Kate will reflect that in the future. So. Campaigning issues, you can be a bit cynical about them. I mean, I think Clancy mentioned about, I think she might have mentioned inequality, or was getting there. I mean, Kate has made it clear that her life's mission is to improve the first 5 years for every child in Britain and elsewhere, really. And part of that, she has said certainly through her aides, is reducing inequality. And I've asked. I think it's a fair point to make that perhaps the media could hold the monarchy to account a bit more, but we do try. And I certainly remember asking, well, you're talking about inequality, but your family, your children, you essentially tell us that your children are more special than other people's children, and they're going to go to private schools. They were born in private hospital wing. How do you reduce inequality when you are at the apex of inequality? And I think that's an interesting question they're going to face continually. But they've said that she wants to use her position to highlight these issues and to. It's difficult because they can't seem to be political in the sense of getting involved in party political debates and favouring one party over another, but they can highlight issues that politicians then become part of the agenda for politicians, and so it's about creating a national conversation. And she will hope that policymakers will change the way they approach the first 5 years of children's lives to help.
Can I quickly, sorry, if it's possible, just to ask Laura to come back on that, because just for your reflections on tonight as well, Laura, but also particularly to this point of the tension that comes with the kind of allegations of contradiction. When you listen to tonight, for example, and you think about what the monarchy might look like in 20 years, for example, what do you think?
Well, I was kind of at that point of inequality. The idea that Kate Middleton will solve inequality is ludicrous. Just as the idea that Harry and Meghan will solve inequality is ludicrous, because they're privileged, right? We can talk about various versions of inequality, but they're incredibly privileged. I mean, my version of a monarchy in 20 years would be it doesn't exist, but I don't think that's going to happen as much as I would like it to. But I really think I'm not saying that the reign of Charles will end the monarchy. I don't think it will, but I think it will look very, very different. And I think people's responses to it will change. And I think, when we see the polls, the Queen is always the most popular one. A lot of the discussion around the monarchy and the monarchy being kind of part of the status quo, part of history, part of heritage, I think comes from that idea of the Queen being kind of this last link, in quote marks, to like World War II and kind of those post-war narratives of British strength and all of these things that often particularly right-wing politicians will draw on, and I think her going will completely change that, and I think it will massively change the narrative about monarchy. And I think if we're seeing a rise in younger people not approving of monarchy now, I think that will rocket when she goes, actually. And I'm not saying I think there will be a republic, I don't, but I really do think it will completely change the conversation, because Charles just doesn't represent those those things of heritage and history. Gender, I think, plays a really important factor in the Queen, in the fact that she's kind of often positioned as this, for want of a better word, little old woman clutching a handbag that we need to protect, that kind of very gendered language as well, that I think is really important. So I think, and I do think, I agree with the person who said I think the discussion around William and Harry will change when Charles comes in as well, actually. And I think part of this, I think it all comes down to inequality. I think the fact that young people are the ones that are most likely to oppose monarchy comes down to the fact that it often shows that young people are kind of more likely to vote left and are more likely to be aware of inequality and all of those things. I think that's what it comes down to.
Interesting. Okay, and Jimmy, you wanted to come in.
I'll try not to provoke another outburst from Charles this time. I think it's really interesting to kind of look at the soft power effects of the royal family and whether internationally, Trump bending over backwards to have tea with the Queen and kind of bragging about it when he was back home as if it was some kind of victory. And half the countries that exist in the world today didn't really exist in their current form when the Queen first took the throne. The royal family does give us that soft power effect overseas, but how much of that is linked to the Queen and how much is linked to the institution, the monarchy? When she dies, will Charles still have that same kind of effect overseas and at a diplomatic level, or will it die with her?
I think it was plain to. Do you want me to say? Yeah, I think it was plain to see at COP26 that the Queen's decision that she couldn't attend, she wasn't up to attending, and she was only going to address world leaders by video, was a real letdown for them. I mean, they come. I think one of the reasons they were coming over was to see this woman who has been on the world stage for so long, been on the throne for 70 years, but before then known the movers and shakers in society around the world. I think Charles is still a really well-known figure internationally, and I think, you mentioned Trump. I mean, he got Trump talking about climate change, and even Donald Trump was, saying he'd listened to what the Prince of Wales had said about it. So I think Prince Charles still does have soft power, and I think the Cambridges have soft power, and I think that is the monarchy's biggest selling point, really. That and their convening power bring people together. I think you might see a King Charles holding a summit on climate change, for example, at Buckingham Palace, and bringing world leaders together. I think, to illustrate that point about the soft power, funny enough, go back to Harry. I hadn't been doing this job that long when I went out to Lesotho when he was on his gap year, working with HIV AIDS orphans in one of the world's poorest countries. And I think there must have been maybe 100 media there that day. There was like an open day when we were invited to go and talk to him and film him and talk to the people he was working with. And there were various UN agencies there, and one of them said to me, he said, we've been trying for 3 or 4 years to get the media to throw the spotlight on the crisis we're facing in Southern Africa with HIV/AIDS. And in one day, we've got, suddenly the entire world's press is here and writing and filming and talking about this. And I think that's one of the royal family's biggest selling points still.
Can I ask you the same question I asked Laura, which is, what do you think the royal family and the monarchy will look like in 20 years?
Well, I can turn that around slightly. I think one of the worries for the institution must be that it's an ageing institution. So, you've got Charles now is 73, Camilla 74. You'd think that he's probably going to accede to the throne in the next 4 or 5 years at the latest. So he's going to be pretty old when he becomes king. And then if he lives to be 99, 100, William's going to be in his late 50s, early 60s. It's a very old institution. By that time, I suspect most people won't be interested in King William. They'll be interested in Prince George and Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. And I think, personal view, one of the things I think that the monarchy needs to think about, it isn't, the monarchists always say it's not a popularity contest, it's not an election, but I think it wasn't really created for an age when people lived to be 100. And we're no longer physically up to doing big parts of the job. And we've seen a pope stand down because he was too old, and we've seen Dutch monarchs and other monarchs stand down because they felt they were too old to do the job. And I think that Queen Elizabeth II was so affected by the abdication crisis in 1936 that has been anathema to her. But I think future monarchs in Britain may need to think about do we get to 80 and or 85 and say enough, and we stand down in favour of somebody younger?
Interesting. Okay, well, on that note, because I'm afraid we've just slightly run over time, but I think it falls to me to slightly sum up this conversation, which is to say that it's obviously a very deeply institutional question, this William versus Harry, if it's a slightly facetious one. It's also obviously an international question, and I think maybe quite crucially a generational question. And one of the things that it strikes us listening to this is that young people who are seemingly the future are kind of more pro the Harry-Meghan way of life than they maybe are the William way of life. But as we know, with young people, they wield relatively little power over decision-making anyway, so maybe it doesn't matter at all. So thanks everyone for coming, and if you have any thoughts, please do email me, lara.spirit@tortoisemedia.com, and we'll hopefully see you for the next ThinkIn, which I believe is on Monday. Tuesday. Thanks.